Good afternoon, everyone. This is Tara Clapp from the Columbia Basin Watershed Network. I want to welcome you all to the second webinar in our I'm going to call it our spring series. Today we welcome Kathy Eichenberger with the Columbia River Treaty Review, which I think there's a lot of excitement about this opportunity to hear what Kathy has to say. I'm really pleased with it. I just wanted to do a few housekeeping items before we begin. You may find at some point during the webinar that you get disconnected. If you could just get right back, reconnect back in, that's probably the easiest way to handle it. We have all the attendees set on a blanket mute, and that means that we won't be able to hear you. So if you could use the chat box, or you can type in questions. Kathy will stop a couple times during your presentation and certainly at the end, and we'll be able to have some question and answer. I will be the moderator for most of that, although, if there's something question I would ask you to ask yourself, I will unmute you at that point. So you can contact me for follow-up after the webinar. I think Kathy's going to allow us to share her PowerPoint, and we will have, we're making a recording of this webinar, which we'll get up on our website within a week or two. Let's say that. It depends how much editing we have to do. So I just want to introduce Kathy. She is the director of the Columbia River Treaty Review, and I'm going to let her explain that role a little bit more in her presentation. So I'm going to switch the presenter role over to Kathy, and as soon as she shares her screen, I'll let her start.
Oops. All right. I hope you can see my screen. So good afternoon, and I'm really excited about this webinar. I had a chance to look at the list of people who have registered, and some great people I've worked with in the past, and many I'm engaged with currently, and names of people that I've heard of and very respected, very knowledgeable, experienced, and engaged folks. So thanks for the opportunity. So I'm the executive director of the Columbia River Treaty Review. It's a small little program and nested within the Electricity and Alternative Energy Division of the Ministry of Energy and Mines. It's basically, though, a provincial role that spans cross government, and I'll explain why the province has taken on this role. What I want to talk about today are, what you see on the outline, just a bit of a recap on what the Columbia Treaty is and why we're doing a review. And I think I've noticed over we started this review in the fall of 2011, and people in the basin have been really engaged, and the capacity and the knowledge has increased tremendously, also thanks to some pre-work by the Columbia Basin Trust and a lot of outreach by local governments. But there still are things that people, there are misunderstandings which I'd like to correct if people still have them. Then what are the key issues that have come out of the review, and what has the province decided in response to hearing from basin stakeholders and residents, First Nations, local governments, and others? And then what's happening in the US, or what has happened, and where are we today, and what can we look forward to in the future with, as you can imagine, some uncertain times ahead. So I'll stop after Columbia Treaty Review for some questions, and then after provincial decision for some questions, and then at the end as well. So I love showing this photo, especially when I go down to Portland. Portland is a large city, of course, and they've enjoyed the safety and security of flood prevention of damaging floods. But this is really, if you think that they're underwater at that time, it would be significantly worse today, as people have built into the floodplains, both in our basin, our side of the basin, frankly, and in the U.S. One of the things that people should know, though, that even though only 15% of the basin physically is in Canada, in BC, it actually accounts for about 35% of the runoff, and then high water years, 50% of the water. So 50% of these floodwaters that could occur in Portland comes from BC. It's also one of North America's most powerful rivers. It actually drops 2,600 feet from the headwaters to the mouth. And it produces 35,000 megawatts of capacity. It's the highest producing hydroelectric producing river in North America, basically mostly on the US side. And it's the fourth largest river by discharge in North America, so big river. So as you see on this slide, the impetus, although there had been discussions about managing flows on the Columbia prior, the real impetus was the flooding in 1948. What happened was there was a very, very high freshet, and it basically destroyed the town, the second largest town in Oregon, and there were loss of life. Now, granted, Vanport, which was never rebuilt, was in the floodplain and basically was housing for workers, that supported industry there. Probably not the place to house 35,000 people, but it did basically destroy the entire city. But as you can see, Trail also and continues to be within the realms of potential flooding, and it did suffer quite a lot of damage, although no loss of life on the Canadian side. So that was one of the impetus for countries talking about what became the Columbia Treaty. It's also, after the Second World War, there was a big push for industrialization in the States for power, and they needed power for that. And that was the second impetus. So there were studies, from 48 to 61, about, a great number of years of studies. The International Joint Commission was involved, and they looked at different sites for projects, what would be the objectives, what would be the benefits of power and flood control. And they did look at the time at other objectives on environmental and water supply and so on. But at the end of the day, they decided to just that dealing with flood control and power production would also have corollary benefits in the other sectors, rightly or wrongly. So the treaty was signed in 1961, but was only ratified in 1964. And the delay was because that BC and WAC Bennett at the time basically said, hang on, this is provincial jurisdiction development of natural resources. We don't have funds to build the dams. And then WAC Bennett, of course, had this vision of the peace and the Columbia. So he was a bit of a rabble rouser, and he interfered. But what he did achieve is that he and the province negotiated an agreement in 1963 between Canada and BC, which transferred most obligations to implement the treaty. That means building and operating the dams and reservoirs, but also the benefits, and we'll talk about the benefits as well. And that is really unique in a sense of international treaties, agreements between Canada and the province, and I don't know that there's any been done before that or since. And that is why BC actually has a very strong role in any changes or decisions on the treaty going forward. So in 1964, the treaty was ratified. Also between then, there was negotiation for the sale of the power benefits, which I'll explain later, that basically funded the construction of the treaty facilities. The other thing to know is that to implement the treaty created what they call entities, and in the United States, it's two federal and agencies that the heads of which form the U.S. entity, and that's Bonneville Power Administration, which is a federal kind of power agency, but that is dedicated to the Pacific Northwest, and the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, which of course is involved in flood mitigation, disaster, and et cetera, and operates dams in the Pacific Northwest. On the Canadian side, BC Hydro is the Canadian entity for the purpose of implementing the treaty, operating operationally, but the province of BC is also an entity for the purposes of disposal of the Canadian entitlement, which are the benefits that flow to BC, which I'll explain later. So you have two provincial, a province of BC and the BC Crown Corp on one side and two federal agencies on the other side. And that continues to be a bit of a consternation for our U.S. friends who have a hard time seeing how that works over here. I just want to go quickly over the key provisions, because I know a lot of you know a lot about the treaty per se. So basically, we Canada agreed to construct 3 dams to provide 15.5 million acre feet of water storage, so space for water. 15 million acre feet is exactly what it is. It's like 1 foot deep times 15.5 million acres is 50, so it's a kind of a neat measurement because you can visually kind of figure it out, but it's a lot. It basically doubled the effective storage on the Columbia system. So Duncan was built first, Duncan Dam in 1967, then Keenly Side, and then Mica in 1973. And now it's important for people to know Revelstoke Dam is not a treaty dam. That being said, they wouldn't have built Revelstoke had there not been Mica. The other piece of the treaty is that the U.S. had the option, which they carried out, to construct Libby Dam in Montana. And that is a Koocanusa Reservoir, which flows all the way up into the East Kootenay, about 42 kilometers up in the East Kootenay. And so and they operate that for power production. They also have operations for sturgeon, salmon, and bull trout. The other thing that people often misunderstand is that there's no end date for the treaty. It's not ending in 2024. It doesn't have to be renegotiated. It's evergreen, so it goes on indefinitely, but it needs 10 years notice to terminate. And the earliest it could have been terminated is 2024 if either country would have issued a termination notice by September 2014. That didn't happen. It continues on until such time as either country does issue a termination notice. The other thing there's a misunderstanding is that you do not need to issue a 10-year notice to make any changes. Either, the countries can agree to make changes at any time in the treaty, formal treaty amendments, or within the treaty framework, operational changes. So that is also what I hear often, is that this is the one shot, the one time where we can make changes to the treaty. I think that going forward, we're going to see a lot more adaptive management incorporated in the treaty, and that we'll be able to adapt to new science, new societal values, and of course, climate change. So I'm an engineer, I'm a hydraulic engineer, so I always have to show dams. And so here they are. Duncan has no generation. It does regulate flows that goes through the Kootenay system that produces power, so it is regulated for that. It also provides flood protection to downstream communities, Caslow and Nelson and so on. Keenly Side had no power until 2000s, and there's only a little generation, 185 megawatts. It has a lot of storage. It is the jewel for flood protection, especially for the U.S. Mica has now, with Mica 5 and 6 turbines in there, 3,000 megawatts, And below, Revelstoke not being a treaty dam, but below has 2,500. They're thinking of putting another 500 with a Rev 6. So that would mean in that, just that little stretch, 6,000 megawatts, that's 6 Site Cs. And so, that with the Kootenay Canal and other smaller Fortis facilities and so on produce basically half the power for the province. And then there's Libby Dam, and sorry, I don't know how many megawatts. I should figure that out one day. So the treaty provisions were that Canada would operate that 15.5 million acre feet for power generation. That was to optimize generation in the U.S. And then the incremental electricity that the U.S. could produce, because of how we managed flows across the border, we would get half of that. So that's called a Canadian entitlement. So it's half of the extra power that they can produce because of how we manage flows at certain times of the year in BC. So the first 30 years of this entitlement, and the entitlement is not, and that's why people get confused too. It's delivered in energy and capacity, but basically as electricity to the border. And we use it in BC at times when there's maintenance on certain dams and some turbines are down, but we typically sell it back on the market. And but at the time, between 1961 and 1964, nobody had money to build these dams, and so Canada, BC, pre-sold the Canadian entitlement to U.S. utilities for $254.4 million. It allowed us to build the dams. We needed that money to build the dams because WC Bennett wanted the two river vision for hydroelectric production. And at that time was a lot of money. Today, well, you look at it and maybe it's not so much. On the other hand, we do have, of course, Mica and Revelstoke that are legacy or heritage, assets to us that continue to produce power for BC. Now, after 30 years, we started to get the electricity back because the 30 years of pre-sale was over, and so it comes, as I said, to the border. We sell it back if we don't need it, and it makes between 100 and 150 million a year currently. There was a time during California brownout that we made like 600 million. There are times when we made like 90 or a million or yes per year. And that money goes into BC general revenue. It doesn't go to BC Hydro. It doesn't go to the basin. The province did use some of that funding to create Columbia Basin Trust and Columbia Power Corporation. And Columbia Basin Trust currently has, I think, $55 million a year to benefit social, economic, and environmental well-being in the basin. But the Canadian entitlement goes purely to general revenue in the province. And then for flood control, of the 15.5 million acre feet that's used for power production, part of that, 8.45 MAF, is used to prevent or minimize damaging floods, both in Canada and the U.S. And that was pre-sold. The U.S. bought it for $64.4 million for 60 years of flood control. Some people criticize the deal for it being way too cheap. There are definitely some, that definitely has some merit. However, that assured flood control that people have become comfortable with and feel safe, that deal expires in 2024. And so regardless of if we change anything in the treaty, all of a sudden in 2024, the U.S. no longer can rely on BC reservoirs. They have to change to a call-upon system, which is a lot more ad hoc, a lot riskier, and it's not well defined in the treaty. So that's a big point of concern, and it has implications on our side of the border, and I'll touch upon that in a few slides. So what happened when we built the dams and reservoirs? Well, there have been and continues to be a lot of negative impact from the footprint and from the operation. And, you know, there's strong pressures being reviewed. People are saying that there needs to be some much further mitigation of those impacts and improvement to environmental and social conditions in the basin. Um, some of the people who were affected are still in the basin, are in the area. I know if Janet's on the computer, Janet Spicer, their family farm, they lost their family farm. There are others who had to move, their houses that were burned. And people, you know, they weren't consulted. They were just told, you know, we're building these things, you got to go. And whole communities were displaced. People, you know, can imagine living in idyllic areas where they've been farming and generations of families, and all of a sudden they have to leave. And it's still very, very emotional, regardless of where you go in the basin. Could be Koocanusa and Bates Lake, could be the Casper, Fauquier. It's really tough. And First Nations have lost their cultural sites. They have their ancestral remains that continue to be eroded and sticking out of the banks, and also the basket of what sustained them for millennia. So definitely huge impacts. Also to the ecosystem, fish and wildlife. Some of the best habitat was lost. The air quality issues you can see on your right. That's Kinbasket. That was supposed to be the recreation area of that, you know, where people would have waterfront properties. Well, sometimes not. And there are issues both in the Kinbasket and in Arrow, the north towards Revelstoke, where you know, windstorms create dust storms and impact air quality. Really good productive forest land was lost. Of course, they chopped, and they didn't remove all the timber before flooding because they ran out of time. There were some direct transport routes that were lost, and now the transportation travel time is costlier and longer for both private citizens and for commerce. And then tourism, you know, it was portrayed as this was going to be a big tourism boom with all these nice reservoirs. And, you know, in fairness, there was some. So, for example, Koocanusa Reservoir, there definitely is a lot more commercial recreation, good or bad, there. But, you know, there are a lot of people who have moved to the basin post-reservoir maybe did not know how idyllic a lot of these areas were. And Arrow Lakes were lakes before, with river in between. And, you know, I don't think that anyone could claim that the recreational values are better today than they were then. So all these issues are very much top of mind for many Columbia Basin residents, and not just those who were there when it happened, but, you know, and some are kind of philosophical at times and saying, well, you know, that's how they did things then. But today, you know, this younger generations or further generations use today's social environmental lenses and see us from a social justice lens that what happened was totally unacceptable, and it wouldn't have happened like that today. So why did we do a review? As I mentioned, the earliest that the treaty could have been terminated was 10 years notice. So obviously governments on both sides of the border said, well, we have the opportunity to terminate. We need to think about, should we terminate? Should we carry on as is? Should we change it? And that, of course, required a process. And we know that the called upon flood control is not well defined in a treaty, and that changes regardless. We know that there were only two main objectives, and environmental or ecosystem function wasn't considered. And so this was the opportunity, and the provincial government, because of the BC-Canada agreement, was leading the process. And the provincial government formed in fall of 2011 a small team, which I lead, but also we reach out across the different government agencies, and I'll talk about that. But basically, I got one marching order and basically said, do it right this time, because it wasn't done. And, you know, the proof will be in the pudding at the end, but that was basically the key direction on how to engage residents, local government stakeholders, and First Nations. So what did we do? We started this process, and we had coordination across environmental agencies, ministries, agriculture, any ministry that had a mandate that touched upon this, forest lands, natural resource operations. We worked closely with Canada, both Global Affairs Canada, which is now the lead. They used to be Foreign Affairs Canada. They're called Global Affairs Canada, but also with Environment Canada, which is now Environment Climate Change Canada, DFO, INAC, and other. So we had a Fed-Prov group that we worked, and Natural Resources Canada. We also consult with First Nations and continue to do so, and I'll speak to that. Engagement of basin residents, and then we needed to pay attention to what was happening in the U.S. And so we did a number of studies in advance of going out to engage and consult. And so we looked at modeling. BC Hydro had done, and we didn't start from scratch. Number of areas like there had been some water use plans for certain reservoirs, and not the Kootenay system, but the others, Duncan and Columbia. And so we looked at what information was available there. We looked at other information that came out of previous environmental assessments and so on. And so we, when we were looking at what were the trade-offs and what was the input from people at that time, and then we looked at different scenarios of optimal power and maximizing flows for trout and whitefish that came out of the water use plan on the Arrow side, optimizing for wildlife and vegetation, which led to, we'll talk about a scenario that we're continuing to investigate to improve ecosystem function. Looked at MICA environmental and recreational opportunities for operating the reservoir basket differently. Looked at flows from Arrow to enhance trout, whitefish, stace, and sculpin, and of course sturgeon, which is on the sour list. What kind of flows coming out could perhaps help sturgeon hang in there and if not thrive, actually increase in population. We also did performance measures looking, because the Kootenay system didn't have a water use plan. We looked at trade-offs and modeling in fisheries interests with Lower Duncan, Kootenay Lake, and Kootenay River, and also flood control and power and recreation targets for Kukanusa. And we work closely with the Okanagan Nation Alliance. They're concerned, even though they're in the Okanagan, but they also assert title in the Arrow Lakes area. But their key concern of theirs was how the flows from under the Columbia Treaty may have affecting negatively the Okanagan sockeye. So we've been working closely with them on that. And we work very closely with the Pacific Climate Impacts Consortium, or PCIC, to look at climate change scenarios and looking forward and what will change in the basin and how we would have to adapt for all of the different values. And also input from the UNBC Western Canadian Cryospheric Network that modeled glacier and hydrologic change. So we did a lot of that work, and the link there is if you're interested in those studies, so you can have a look at that. Then we of course have a duty to consult under the Canadian Charter, Section 35, rights of First Nations, but we wanted to obviously do more than just meet our legal duty. But we did obviously have to do that, and we crafted with each different nation group, the Tnaha Nation, Shikwaban, which Shuswap people may recognize, and the Okanagan. And so we had a separate tailor-made process unique to each group, and one group wanted to have different communities consulted separately, some together. Whatever they wished and how to proceed, we did that. There are separate consultation reports resulting from that, but First Nations I wish them to remain confidential at this time. So we're honoring that. We're continuing to consult with them on, what are their rights, of course, but what are all their interests in the entire basin? What are their thoughts on what the future of the treaty should look like, and how are potential changes, how they might impact their interests and rights if we were to terminate, continue, or enhance the treaty, and what would enhance look like? And enhancing is still what's driving the conversation today. From the First Nations consultation, here are some of the key issues. So obviously, the historical and ongoing impacts on First Nations interests and values, on fisheries, on wildlife, on vegetation, plants, medicinal, and for gathering. All that was lost, and interest in trying to recover or mitigate some of those impacts. Return of the salmon in the Upper Columbia. All of the First Nations are very strongly united in this aspirational goal of seeing salmon back up north of the border. And they are conducting some preliminary studies to see whether that would be biologically feasible, and in coordination with the tribes south of the border. The preservation and securing of archaeological and cultural sites are also very, very important. As the reservoir levels go up and down, it continues to erode, and a lot of the cultural sites become exposed and are either damaged by weathering or vandalism or whatnot. And there's a great debate on within the First Nations on whether it would be more appropriate to keep them dry and secure in some way, or to keep them underwater. And so there's still a lot of discussion on how best to identify, because they're discovering every year thousands of archaeological and cultural sites, and then once identified, how do you protect them? First Nations are, of course, they're very interested in sharing revenue from the Columbia Treaty, and want to have a say on its governance and decision making. Now to the public consultation. We had 3 rounds of community workshops over 18 months, and the first thing we ask communities is basically how do you want to be consulted? And so in May, June of 2012, we went to 7 communities around the basin and to explain the treaty and the review process, to get feedback on how they want to be consulted. And we gave them a number of choices, and they could all, kind of prioritize. And at the end, we were told, we want you to do it all, and so we did. And that was a good call. And we developed a scan and scope of basin interests based on information from previous processes, as I mentioned earlier, and any new information from residents. So instead of going back to the communities and saying, oh, tell us what's important to you, and everyone saying, but we've been telling you for the last 20 years. And I know that because I lived for 10 years in Crescent Valley and worked in Nelson, and I knew of government people coming from Victoria, asking the same questions all the time. We call it drive-by consultation, and come back, and it goes in a black box, and that's it. Well, that was not what was going to happen. So we said, this is what we've heard in the past that's important to you. What are the values and interests? Is there something we're missing? Is there anything more? So and then we also asked the communities, what kinds of studies, what kind of information do you need now that you heard about the treaty, and what are some of the options for the future? So we went back, and then we had a second round of 8 community sessions in November 2012, where we shared the results of the modeling of the three scenarios, and also other more sub-regional studies or other studies that people had asked us to do, to share back and give back to them. And then at that same time, that round, we said, given all of this, please provide advice to government on what the future of the treaty should look like. And basically the key strategic questions, which was the first point of the treaty review, of should we terminate the treaty, status quo, or make changes to it. And then we had another round of community sessions in March, June of 2013, where the basis of that was our draft consultation report. It basically outlined everything we had heard in all of the different communities and their concerns and their advice. And basically, we asked, did we capture it all? And also we had a draft recommendation to government. So this was recommendation to cabinet. Normally we're not allowed to share that publicly, but we got a permission to go and say, these are the recommendations to cabinet. Please give us feedback on how you feel about that. And throughout that, we had a conference, we had website, blog, Facebook, Twitter. We still all have that. We've had newsletters that were very popular, and we were remiss because our team shrunk a bit since 2014, but we want to start up again. And one of the things that was really, really neat was that the local politicians in all the communities and the regional districts, they got really engaged. They came together and they created this local government committee, and they had their own rapport and engagement with their citizens, and they came out with their own recommendations, and which were mostly kind of in line similar to ours. Some were different, but they were done independently. And we continued to work closely with the local governments committee, and they continue to be very active. They went to Ottawa a little while ago to impress upon the leaders there on how this is important and how it affects the lives of their citizens. And so the provincial decision was released March 13th, 2014. It pretty much, it's not consensus. And I was telling people, are you seeking consensus? And I said, you know what? There's the good news. We're not going to get consensus. We would like general agreement, because people have such diverse views, but I think what we did is reflect the input, and there's general agreement, but we also reflected the dissenting opinion, which there is. There are people who would like to see the treaty terminated and recapture control of all of our reservoirs, and that is definitely a very legitimate position. Generally, the people said, let's continue the treaty for now. Let's try and seek improvements within its existing framework. That was our language. Basically, it meant not starting from scratch, because the government, anyway, thought, start from scratch, you'll never, it's why not try and build upon, some of the bones? And they had their 14 principles to guide in discussions for treaty, and you'll hear treaty renewal, treaty modernization, and so on. So what were some of those principles? Well, the high-level themes were basically the overarching principle of the treaty is for two countries to create and share benefits equitably. And there are countries all over the world who are trying to figure out transboundary water management kind of accords, and we did a lot of research and hired academics and others to look into what else is out there. Is there something better? And it was always, there's some parts are better, but different. We have seen no agreement, transboundary agreement that shared the benefits. They share the costs, but they don't share the benefits. And we definitely want to hold that as a North Star. And it could be not just economic benefits, it could be social benefits, it could be environmental benefits. And we also said, there's a lot of value to the U.S. of upstream regulation. And frankly, we think there is more value than what BC is receiving currently. Right now, of course, the flood control has provided to be a lot more valuable currently than the $64 million. Flows for salmon, water supply, recreation, navigation, all of these benefits are kind of side benefits to how we manage for power and flood control. But we also manage for fisheries on both sides of the border, and I'll get to that. So we really think we need to revisit how do we describe those benefits and how do we share them equitably, and a recognition that there continues to be impacts to residents and regional interests in the basin, social impacts, economic impacts, and very much environmental impacts. Um, Another principle is that the changing flood control in 2024 is actually it's not a good way to manage flood risk. And the how it would work is that the U.S. would have to basically empty all their reservoirs before asking BC to provide flood space for flood waters on our side of the border. That is going to cause quite a bit of concern and hardship on the U.S. side because they may not be able to refill. They will have impacts to fisheries, have impacts to water supply. But you know, before we say, well, so what? Koocanusa would be a reservoir that would be impacted as well. And so, you know, we need to really think hard about the trade-offs between what the call on flood control can do versus a more planned flood risk management where reservoirs are not drained, you know, very quickly, or you get a lot of and may potential increased flood risk in Canada. And so that's something to seriously think about. The other thing is on the climate change that there will be need to collaborate even more on all of the climate change predictions, and they keep getting updated. PKIC is coming up with a new update soon, I think in May, show that in BC actually we will have the same or more total inflow into our reservoirs. We'll still have for 2040, 2060 a snowpack. Maybe a little less snow, a little more rain, but you see all the colored graphs and the maps, and we still got it. Not to say that we don't need desperately to address climate change and reduce greenhouse gases, but we're better off than part of the basin south of the border. The more south and west you go, where their snowpack will disappear. They will not get snowpack. They'll get rain, and rain, going down the river and into the ocean earlier in the spring. And so I'm more concerned about extreme rainfall events and floods, and also more concerned about drought. And we saw in 2015 and 2016, especially 2015, a very low water year, hot, warm temperatures, and it was quite devastating for the U.S., and it also impacted us. This is just a graph to show you, what the flood risk management, how it has actually protected our own communities. This is 2012 when we had that big rain on snow, and the green, the red is what the discharge from Birchbank, so that's below Keenly side, would have been without Arrow Reservoir and Kinbasket, and the blue is what we maintained the level at. We're able to keep it below, and even there were damages to sewage lagoons and trail and Castlegar and infrastructure to also Janelle, the transport road access, Janelle was cut off, and so on. So usually around 2010 there, that's where you start to get a bit in trouble. And then we do need to, as I said at the beginning, be a little more adaptable. We can't just, whatever the changes may be, say, okay, we're good for the next 50 years. I think we need to be adaptable to changing conditions, as I said, but have a bit of uncertainty, so we're not kind of every 2 or 3 years kind of changing the system, and people have no sense of what's working and what's not working. And for ecosystems, it wasn't included in the original treaty. We know we need to incorporate ecosystems, and further improvements can be explored inside and outside of the treaty. And the treaty has flexibility to do that. So as a result of the water use plan, we got agreement, and the U.S. had also fisheries objectives to meet as well, to change the flows and reduce the flows for power production, but increase flows for sturgeon, for trout and whitefish on our side of the border, and it also helped for salmon in spring, in the spring. So salmon going to the ocean. So we can do that. We can make changes within the treaty. We can shift focus from power to ecosystems. In this case, it's primarily fisheries. In the future, maybe we're looking at a more holistic kind of approach to looking at ecosystems. Now here's where I think oh yeah, we'll talk to the key issues a little later. I have a bit more on that, but it's a slide I forgot to delete. Sorry about that. And we've talked about these, but the bottom is important, that we're committed to continuing engagement First Nation to public throughout any negotiations. And one of the things that we've done is we've created Columbia Basin Regional Advisory Committee, and that is as a result of what we heard during the review. People said, well, we generally like very much how we've been engaging and the intensity and so on. Some of the community said this has been kind of cathartic, that it's the first time that people had a chance to come together and talk about what happened and have a voice. And so the Columbia Basin Regional Advisory Committee, it's comprised of a diverse, people from across the basin geographically with different interests. Local government is part of it, First Nations, the Fortis, CPC, Columbia Power Corporation, BC Hydro, other industries, non-government organizations, citizens from community, and their role is to provide input into hydro system planning domestically, but also to provide advice and input to the Columbia Treaty Review Team for any improvements going forward. And so that is ongoing. And before I go into the US process, I will stop now for questions.
Thanks, Kathy. I'll just unmute myself here. There's quite a few questions have come in. One of the early ones in terms of the benefits, the monies from the Canadian entitlement, the sold energy, go to the provincial general coffers. The question is, what percentage of the total benefits actually come back to the Columbia Basin?
Well, that's if it's direct transfer of funds, none. If it's part of general revenue and services, and that's just part of the revenue that the province gets, and then does what provincial governments do, then that's it all contributes to that. But as a direct funding directly from Canadian entitlement to the basin, there is none. The province maintains that it created Columbia Basin Trust and invested $250 million for the trust and $250 million for CPC to create revenue that would continue to be solely spent and invested in the basin. So that's one way of looking at it. So that's big. But for the Canadian entitlement, it just goes straight to the big pot, general revenue, where all your taxes and everything else goes.
Okay. There's a couple of questions from Eileen Peaks, about the issue of the extinction of the Sinai-Cerro Lakes people, the possibility of this erroneous. So here's the question. Sorry, can you address the issue of the extinction of the Sinai-Cerro Lakes people and the possibility of this erroneous federal dismissal of Indigenous rights in the Columbia River main stem valley being rectified during the area of treaty review? And then again, when I think when you were talking about specific First Nations, she says, here I do not see the First Nation whose burial remains are throughout the main stem of the Columbia River Valley. The Arrow Lakes Sinaites are not equivalent to the Okanagan Nation Alliance. So.
Okay, yeah, oh, I know. Hi, Eileen. So the Columbia River Treaty Review is looking at the Columbia River Treaty. It's not a process to determine and define title and rights between the First Nations and including the Sinaiaks that Canada deemed extinct. There are overlapping claims of the First Nations in the various parts of the Columbia Basin, and it is not a simple process to resolve those between the First Nations, and then between the First Nations and BC and Canada. So the Columbia Treaty Review is not a process to deal with that.
Okay, another question from Jim Claricoats. Is the province's support level towards salmon restoration low, medium, or high?
Well, the province supports it. Our minister stood up in the forum and basically said, yes, of course, it would be a wonderful achievement. But this is one where Canada has basically the sole jurisdiction on transboundary anadromous fish, and they have stepped up, and they have said that they are going to be leading that initiative. So they've had conversations with the First Nations on that, and they continue to have those conversations.
Okay. Cedra Eichenauer. Hi, Cedra. Why have the entities not completed an updated post-regulation study of flood risk management? What is the actual risk under status quo operations, and how much storage is actually required going forward past 2024?
Wow. Ooh, Cedra, you really something to chew on. Well, so after 2024, if nothing happens, there is no defined required storage, proactive or planned storage. So in a way, the answer would be zero. But if the U.S. needs our assistance, then we are obliged to evacuate our reservoirs very, very quickly to provide that, so that they don't have severe or significant flood damage or loss of life. What the U.S. has said, and we'll talk about in a minute, is that they don't like called upon because it's too ad hoc, and we don't even agree on how it would work, frankly. There are two very different views between us, BC, and the U.S. on how that would work, but it wouldn't work very well. So the question is, what would be better than called upon? And that is still being explored.
Okay. Cedra wanted to clarify that question actually came from Ed. I missed that. It's probably Ed McGinnis, hey?
Hi,
anyway. Ed. Okay. Sorry about that, Cedra. And Ed. So, and then Natasha would like to say, could you expand a little further on the role of the federal government in the process thus far?
Oh, okay, yes. And I apologize. And what I could do is actually add some slides to that and correct the duplicate slides that I didn't delete when you post it. So Canada has been by our side since the beginning. In 2011, we had an MOU with Canada on how we work together. BC felt that we should be the lead for the review process in BC, and they supported us wholeheartedly. That being said, they had, as far as, especially in regards to First Nations consultation, they had a Canadian representative who worked, basically side by side with us in consultation with First Nations, but also attended the public and community, some of the community meetings, but they recognize that the interests are regional, they're provincial, and Canada has a constitutional responsibility of negotiating international treaties. It is true, but they recognize that the main interest in the engagement is provincial. So we are very pleased that with how we've been working very closely with them, but the roles are changing somewhat. So they also contributed to input into some of our environmental studies and so on with the different departments. Now that BC has made this decision in 2014, which Canada basically supported in principle. They didn't have to do a review and they didn't have to make a decision. They relied on us and they support in principle where the province is at. But now, as we prepare for negotiations, it now shifts where Canada is the lead in negotiations under a constitution with the United States. Now, Canada has always said that Team Canada includes BC, and we are working together to explore and refine our negotiating positions and our options, and continue to work very closely with a core team that they have. Now, you know, they've been criticized by not having named a chief negotiator. Well, they've been having a team of 4 people at least who've been working very closely with Columbia Treaty Review team here in BC for the last 6 years. I think they're five. And so, you know, I think that when I see how it's working in the U.S., I think we're tighter. We're tighter here on the Canadian side. And so, you know, we support each other, and the Director General of North America, Global Affairs Canada, always says there will be no daylight between BC and Canada in positions, in negotiating positions going forward.
Okay, thank you. And I'm going to count that as answering Rick Simpson's question, which was also about the federal negotiator. I'm just wondering, it's 2:27 and there's a lot more good questions.
Oh, and I'm not finished the presentation, so I'm happy to go on. I have a lot more time.
I think that's probably. I think we'll probably just extend the time a little bit, because I think that that would give people a chance. There seems to be a lot of interest.
I only have about 5 more slides. I know I didn't stop as often as I said I would during the presentation, as you can tell once I get going. Would you like me to just conclude the next 5 slides and then open it up for more questions?
Yeah, let's do that.
Okay, because that might answer some questions that people might have. Okay, we talked about that. The U.S. process. So, okay, what happened? And you know, we had a wonderful discussion in CBRAC, Columbia Basin Regional Advisory Committee, and I encourage everyone to click on to our website and then go to public engagement, and you can see all of the presentations that were ever made in CBRAC, and including a more expansive on the U.S. process and U.S. recommendations. All of the minutes are posted, and all the presentations are there, and the members of CBRAC that are in all the communities spread across the basin are your point of contact into that committee. So there's a plug for CBRAC. So what happened in the U.S.? People are interested in saying, okay, now we know what happened in BC, Canada. What about the U.S.? Well, they had something called the Sovereign Review Team process, and that was a closed door process. It was a confidential process that had Bonneville Power Administration, the U.S. Army Corps engineers, 5 tribal representatives representing the 15 tribes, federal agencies, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, Bureau of Reclamation, Bureau of Land Management, Environmental Protection Agency, USFS, if you know it, USGS, and anyway, a bunch of acronyms I don't quite remember, but anyway, a bunch of federal agencies, representatives from governments of Oregon, Washington, Montana, and Idaho, and so it was a fairly substantial group, but they worked and met frequently and worked very hard during the years, but it was a confidential process, so that was one part of it. Then the U.S. Army Corps and Bonneville Power Administration conducted regional listening sessions that produced results from the modeling and studies that were developed and suggested by the Sovereign Review Team. And Sovereign Review Team basically laid out what what the study plan would be and what they wanted to see examined. And they went out to the different cities and presented those findings in these regional listening sessions. And people from my team went to pretty much all of those listening sessions because we wanted to hear as well, not only what their studies, what their results were, and there's a web link at the end that you can go yourself and look at everything that happened in the U.S. And we also wanted to hear what the conversations were in the U.S. They also then reached out to other stakeholders. People were complaining that, you know, they weren't in the small group of the sovereign review team, but they had clear interests themselves, such as the navigation sector, the irrigation agricultural sector, the power sector. None of those sectors were involved in the sovereign review team, and environmental organizations. And so Bonneville Power and the Corps reached out then specifically to those sectors. They had public comments on draft recommendations, which you can also see, and you can see the public comments on those on their website. And they submitted, the timing was somewhat similar to ours. We submitted our recommendation to our provincial cabinet in December 2013. They submitted theirs to the Department of State in Washington in December 2013. And then they, of course, we got a provincial decision in March 2014. They started a federal interest review they call a Circular 175 process that basically looked at how the recommendations, and I'll go into the highlights of those, would affect the federal interest from a national perspective. And they had the number of departments involved in that. And basically took from December 2013 to October 2016, so almost 3 years for them to come out with, for that process to be completed, and for them to get a negotiating mandate that was signed off on October 7th by the then Undersecretary of State. And of course, they didn't reveal the outcome of their federal interest review and their negotiating mandate. Obviously, neither side, Canada, BC, or US, are going to just, you know, publicize what the negotiating mandate is and their options. But there they sit. Of course, there was a change in government. They have a chief negotiator, Brian Doherty, who we met very early on. I think he was appointed in June 2 years ago, so 15, even though they didn't have a negotiating mandate. But, you know, building relationships and having engagement with the different parties in the Northwest. We're not, and we continue to work with him. We're not, on our side, we're not sure what's going to happen next in the U.S. And so we're taking a wait and see approach. In October, the Undersecretary of State sent a letter to, John Kerry sent a letter to Stéphane Dion, Foreign Affairs Minister at the time, urging him to start negotiations right away. Of course, now, you know, we're not sure what the intent is, and the dust will have to settle a little bit. I mean, obviously there are higher, you know, we should perhaps accept higher priorities such as NAFTA and self-lumber or whatever, but it's still very much in play, and we're still having engagement with not only their chief negotiator, but the tribes and all the stakeholder groups and sectors in the U.S. So what were part of their recommendations? And I know there's some very fine U.S. federal folks on the phone, so they're very comprehensive, and in fact, there's a preamble of principles which I think we very much support, and there's much in common between the BC principles and a lot of the recommendations. I didn't put the full text there. Just some of the highlights that I thought would be of interest. And I urge you to read the document. It's a well-crafted document. One of the key recommendations is rebalancing power benefits. to reflect the actual value of coordinated operations. So this is where we have a fundamental disagreement, in the sense of many in the U.S. and the power sector feels that BC is receiving far more in benefits from the treaty than what is actually resulting from coordinated operations. And our view is that when you look at the treaty benefits, you need to look at across all of the sectors and all of the interests and values. And we believe that there are way higher benefits in the U.S. That are not necessarily shared with BC. Some of them are, fisheries related. I mean, we augment flows for salmon, 1 million acre feet in the spring. They're having a huge effort to try and recover their endangered species, salmon and steelhead, and they spend, 500-600 million a year, and how we manage flows contribute to that effort. The navigation sector relies on sufficient draft so that they don't ground and not too high flow, so they can make their way up the river. And they have, I think they transport $50 billion worth of goods on the Columbia River. They're recreationally, Grand Coulee, Lake Roosevelt, very important for the region. So, we feel that we should look at the whole value, the benefits of the treaty from a holistic perspective, and not from an emotional perspective or a interest-based, but in a fair way, and that was the principle of the treaty. But basically the recommendation is to reduce, some say 90% of the power benefits that would actually come back to BC. At the same time, the recommendations recognize how the hydro system provides GHG-free power and capacity that also backstop a lot of the interruptible renewables, such as wind, which they have quite a bit of, and the Pacific Northwest and some of the power distributors have some of the lowest or the lowest electricity rates in North America for their customers. I think it's Seattle City Light, or it might be somebody else, I shouldn't say, but some of the power producers have the lowest, much lower than ours, the lowest electricity rates in all of North America. And they want to maintain that as a market and an advantage and attract industry. So very, very understandable, and they also, of course, want to be able to meet load. The U.S. recommendation also said they don't, that this is the core in particular, but a lot of the communities and cities and down the Columbia, that they don't want higher level of flood risk. They want the same level of flood risk. It might be managed or delivered in a different way after 2024. The core has had and is dealing more and more with impacts from climate change on extreme events that are very, very difficult to manage, and are recognizing that the ability of reservoirs to mitigate that risk is very, very important. So this is something that they recognize and called upon is not something that would work well for them. That doesn't make best use of what they feel are the Columbia River Treaty reservoirs. Where we agree, of course, as well, is the flexibility to adapt to climate change. And we're not just talking about extreme flood risk due to really major shifts in hydrological processes, but also in drought and low flow. So we have seen in the last year, but in particular in 2015. What they're also recommending is that they would want the treaty to continue to provide and even increase timing, stream flows, flow augmentations for the U.S. fisheries. So as I said earlier, the treaty has the flexibility under supplemental agreements to manage flows, not for power and flood control, but for fisheries, which is what we're doing to some extent, and they would like more of that. It's important for them to meet their objectives. And in the U.S., it's a very, very litigious kind of environment around fish targets and biological opinions directed by the courts under their Endangered Species Act, and it seems from a naive Canadian perspective that there's always some litigation going on, and we're kind of wrapped up in the sense of this is where they also continue to want to need flows not only in spring during freshet for fish going back out migration of salmon, but also in late summer and early fall, which is of course sometimes problematic and has impacts on our reservoirs. Agree with adapting ecosystem-based function, and which we have, in ours. So there are things obviously that we agree on. The reintroduction of salmon to Canadian spawning grounds. They are currently conducting some feasibility studies and looking at. I think they're tagging salmon in Lake Roosevelt and see whether they're using tributaries in Lake Roosevelt and they're mapping habitat there. And of course they are looking for water supply from us for the expansion of irrigation and municipal and industrial uses. State of Washington, we met with some officials there, and they have for a number of years identified some real challenges just to maintain irrigation for food security and for their agricultural industry with the depletion of their aquifers. And so it's a very top of mind for them. And of course, there's always a lot of litigation and discussion around existing water rights and so on, and how to protect those and still make best use of the water that's available. So there's a lot more. Some of the recommendations, frankly, we have some trouble with, and that we don't agree with. But I wanted to also emphasize some that where there's definitely some room for agreement, and it very much depends on whether you have a whole basin approach or a more regional or sub-regional approach to the Columbia River Treaty, which will basically, I think, form some perspectives on where we go from here. So what are we doing currently? Well, we are looking at scenarios that would require change to the treaty to focus on ecosystem-based function. One of the things that we did, and that was as a result of, and at the behest of community members in Arrow Lakes, and Fauquier and Burton and Nakasp, and Ed McGinnis on there, and Jeanette, and Chris and the Spicers and others, and they've said, we would like you at a public meeting, we want you to investigate how what would be the ecosystem benefits of stabilizing reservoir levels in Arrow Lakes Reservoir and more at a mid-level. And when people live and live around the reservoirs every day and see what's happening day in and day out, who best to suggest some improvements. So we said, okay, and we the province hired consultants from the basin to look into and did a preliminary investigative report, which was out for public consultation. It's on our website. We are now finalizing the report and responding to the comments that we received before going to the next phase. So that's one future option that we're investigating further. The other one is we're going to be taking some insights from that work and looking at, well, how would that apply to the other reservoirs? Could it apply to the other reservoirs? So that is more just a nascent kind of thinking. There was a workshop on that in 2015, I think, in Revelstoke, but we're planning something further on that. And of course, with the mid-hour report, we presented at a meeting in Fauquier a little while ago some of the work that we're doing in conjunction with First Nations, local governments, academics, provincial and federal agencies, and citizen scientists will be not only made available on our web and in our newsletter, but we will be going to communities once we have enough a body of information to present with the people who put the work together, but also get feedback from. We continue to work very closely with Global Affairs Canada, as I mentioned, and making sure that we are ready when negotiations may begin. Obviously, we are committed to going back to local governments, First Nations, citizen, as much as we can when we will be in negotiations, and obviously there's a fine line between keeping a negotiating confidentiality, but still going back to those affected to get their input should there be trade-offs and so on. We're not there yet because we haven't started negotiations with the U.S. But in our mandates reflect the principles and that we've heard, the principles from the BC decision that came from, in the most part, from the First Nation and public engagement, but also continued input that we have between First Nations governments, the provincial and the federal government. And so we are continuing to look at engage First Nations on that and what their role and how they will be involved in potential negotiations. And on Thursday, our BC review team are meeting with the local government committee, CRT local government committee, to discuss how they would like to also remain engaged during potential negotiations. So that is basically how we talked about CBRAC committee meetings. The Upper Columbia, hang on, I know what that stands for. Upper Columbia, Upper Columbia Basin Environmental Collaborative. So that's a collection of Canadian environmental groups formed fairly recently with shared objective of engaging in transboundary discussions concerning potential renegotiation of Columbia River Treaty. And so they're, I think, Wildside, North Columbia Environmental Society, BC Sierra Club. There are a number of these. It's a coalition, and could provide more information on that for people who are interested. And then we continue. Particularly, I continue to go down in U.S. Use, unfortunately, there was a conference recently in Bellingham that I couldn't attend, but otherwise I've been going down, very frequently to the U.S. to speak to all the different interests, either in the public forum or privately, to get them to realize what our interests are and what are the challenges and the impacts of the treaty on our side of the border that they need to recognize, and also to hear from them, and especially now, to understand, is there a change in U.S. interests? There's definitely a change in dynamics. So how much would that affect any discussion that we have with the U.S. on the CRT going forward? So we're continuing to work with Canada. They're the lead around timing, framework, process for potential negotiations. As I said, we haven't, that hasn't been defined yet. And Canada, rightly so, is taking a cautious approach in how to engage and when to engage on which priority with the United States. And like I say, we monitor, we're groups monitoring, changes in federal departments and change in priorities, on the environmental side, on the financial and trade side, on the commerce side, to see, how will that potentially impact, what we believe they may want as to negotiate to meet their objectives and how are these shifts potentially compatible or not with BC and Canadian objectives. So I have the two links. The Columbia Treaty is basically that's our provincial website on the Columbia Treaty. You can see the past studies, past engagement, what we're currently doing on there, and then the one below, that's the U.S. one. So that's 24, and then you can look at what their process entailed, their previous studies, and their full recommendations document. So with that, I am open to questions.
Thank you very much, Kathy. That was a really informative presentation, and there is a ton of questions, so I'll just get right to them. I'm gonna abbreviate some of them, and you'll have to let me know if I don't do a good job. So I'm going to start with one about watershed preservation restoration as a different way to handle, say, flooding. Are you looking into other ways to manage watersheds for, to sort of balance the use of reservoirs and watersheds for flood control, or, that kind of objective?
No, not really, not at this time. It definitely can make a difference, but the sensitivity, on the technically around managing watersheds, such as I would imagine ensuring reforestation and curtailing development and so on, or reattaching side channels or floodplains. That, I think we're looking at that from an environmental mitigation perspective, but not really from a flood perspective, because the hydrology is such that it would make a little difference, but not that much difference. One of the good things, though, is that resulting from the treaty review, local governments have really stepped up and they said, we need to stop allowing people to build in the floodplain, including municipal infrastructure itself. So there's a much higher awareness of that, how important it is to prevent that as a mitigation against flooding.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to just try the next one straight up. It's from Ramona Faust. Kootenay Lake River does reap the benefit of some flood control, but is there a plan for water use plan on this forgotten part of the system to integrate the work of the Fish and Wildlife Compensation Program with development and recreation interests?
Yeah, thanks, Ramona. We are continuing to have discussions with the water controller and of BC and with the local governments committee. There was some back and forth for a while, and it was kind of linked to the potential for Groman Narrows dredging, because that would have provided more flexibility to manage flows in Kootenay Lake in particular. But I don't think, and then it got quiet for a while. But I think that what I hear from the local government committee and from local governments is that they're not letting go of that idea, and the conversation will persist. It's more complicated because you're not dealing with a provincial crown court. It's a Fortis would have to be a player. I think through discussions and CBRAC and even outside with the local government committee, I think that's definitely going to be pursued.
Okay. And Joanne Taylor asks, who are the 4 people working with the treaty process for Canada?
Oh, okay, Joanne. I'm sure they won't mind if I name them. They're not secret people. One is name is Stephen Gluck. One Ken Warren, of course. He is in Victoria. The rest are in Ottawa. Ken Warren, Stephen Gluck, Greg Lemmermeyer, and Chris Wilkie. And the DG of I think the North American Bureau, but I might got that wrong, is Martin Benjamin.
Okay, who was the last one?
Martin Benjamin.
Martin Belay. Okay.
You could
I've,
spell it.
I've slaughtered the French, sorry.
Okay.
Um, Anna Michael Christoph from the Arrow Lakes, you mentioned that if the U.S. is at risk for flooding, they can demand evacuation of our reservoirs. This doesn't make sense to me. Wouldn't they want us to shore up our water so they don't have as much if they're at risk for flooding?
Well, so yeah, it's kind of counterintuitive. So you have to drain the bathtub before you can fill it with flood water. So they would have to call upon Canada early enough after they've done all they could of draining their reservoirs, so that we would and we'd have to increase flows and reduce and increase space in our reservoirs to be able to accommodate the incoming snow melt. Now the difficulty with that is that if you know exactly how much snow there is and how it's going to melt, and you can predict that 4 or 6 weeks in advance, that might be possible. However, if you have a rain on snow event that is not predictable, or that is like we had in 2012, which was extreme, that was historical, well, we could not have provided sufficient space. And so that is the challenge. That's the challenge of climate change. Do you manage for the worst case scenario and the historical rain on snow event, but then if that doesn't happen, the reservoir is sitting almost empty all summer? Or do you factor that in and monitor closely? And I remember being in the cusp in after the 2012 rain on snow, and BC Hydro was asked, well, why didn't you empty the reservoir in advance? Well, they didn't know that about the historical never before rain on snow, and so if you manage to that level, people won't be happy with the lack of refill. So this is a whole new challenge for water managers, reservoir managers. So that's why the Corps doesn't like called upon, and many people don't like called upon. The tribes in the U.S., they don't like called upon, because the potential implications is that, if the Corps, which is, mandated by Congress to protect safety of citizens, manages to include, what may happen and called upon, and with rain on snow, and they realize that called upon may not be able to be operational fast enough to keep people safe.
Okay. Now this question came before you started talking about changes in the administration in the U.S. It's from Rick Simpson from the Okanagan. There's been a marked change in the Washington bracket Trump views on many things environmental. Do you have any early indicators about what those changes or how those changes might affect the CRT process? Do you have anything to add to what you said?
No, I mean, we're monitoring it. It's by and large domestic on the environmental front. I mean, their new directions and developments are happening almost daily. So we're paying very close attention. We have, of course, in the province, we have in the previous office, the Intergovernmental Relations Secretariat, that's paying very close attention. We have a very close relationship with our Canadian consulate in Seattle, who brief us regularly and who are there to assist us in any way. And of course, our Global Affairs Canada section, who we work with, US section. So we're all communicating very, very frequently, almost daily now. But it's too soon. It's too soon to say. And in the State Department, they have a great number of vacancies to fill by appointees. So we don't know if they still want to proceed with negotiations until those positions are filled or not, or are you willing to proceed with the current cadre of people who were part of the previous administration? Those are all unknown. And you know, I think for us, we're not under a time crunch, you know, and I think following Canada's lead of being attentive but cautious is probably very sound.
Okay. So a question from Randy Jensen from Duhamel Watershed Society. Has environmental monitoring resources been a topic for discussion in these negotiations? It would be nice to see way more financial support for this important data.
Well, so if it's, remember we're talking about the treaty now, you know, not monitoring of local watersheds and so on. And so the treaty requires very close monitoring, you know, of flows across the border. The treaty does not address water quality. That is what is considered respective domestic issues. So as far as the treaty itself is concerned, no, it doesn't include anything beyond the hydrometric station at the border.
Okay. Sorry, I shouldn't think about these answers after you. I should just keep reading questions. So Heather Leashai, given that the Libby Dam is a treaty dam, how can or will the Columbia River Treaty Review consider impacts and alternative management for Koocanusa forward? What opportunities will there be for compensation for this region?
Well, those are two kind of questions. So the first one is that we, and reflecting what we've heard, absolutely, from the people around Koocanusa, want to have a say in how Koocanusa is operated. And currently, Libby is operated solely at the discretion of the U.S. Army Corps. And so that is definitely going to be an item for negotiation. Now, how it would be operated for Canadian interests is something that needs to have further discussion. The reason for that is that when we were doing our community rounds, we didn't hear really an agreement north and south reservoir about what would be levels that would, what changes in levels would be preferable, and so you know we need more engagement on that, and you know I'm meeting with regional director area directors on Thursday to discuss that further, because there are people in the northern part of the reservoirs who would like the reservoir lower because of agricultural, you know, concerns, and there are people in the lower part or southern part of the reservoir on the Canadian side who want it higher for recreational. So I think we need some more facilitated discussion around that. And you know that definitely, people were saying, well, we're hearing people call for a water use plan in the Cooney system, and so it could very well be part of that discussion now. But again, the U.S. would have to agree to that. On the other side of the equation, they're operating Libby for. There are operations for sturgeon and bull trout, which you know have advantages for our sturgeon bull trout recovery programs in BC. So it's complex, but we still have a lot more of discussion, engagement, analysis to do for Koocanusa, and who to pay for compensation. So as some of you may know, CBT did provide, I think it was $2 or $3 million sort of compensation program to do some planning on what were the priorities, the studies, the gaps. I have to say that I don't know where they are in that process. I know there's an expectation that there would be further funding to follow to actually carry out those strategic plans.
Okay. Well, it's 3:04, and there's another. There's really a lot of good questions here. Can we keep you for another 10 minutes?
Half an hour. Keep going.
Okay. Super. Where are we? Here we go. Ed, begin us again. We hear from our U.S. friends that the U.S. power providers are lobbying hard to terminate the Canadian entitlement provisions of the treaty. How much is BC willing to bend on this fundamental provision for benefit sharing? Say it really quietly so that they don't hear.
Oh, I would say not at all. That's my final answer.
Okay. Anna Michael Krista, again, you didn't mention the Canadian response to the U.S. desire for spring-summer flows. As I understand it, the original treaty provided for flows out of the Arrow Lakes only after Labor Day weekend. For the last 10 years, more and more the lake levels are dropping severely in summer. And this is related, so I think I missed one question. There's another one about the Arrow, and why did you say it was the jewel on the system for water storage?
Well, it's the jewel for flood control for the U.S. because it can react more rapidly than, in a more timely way than a kin basket. We do know, and we have seen in the last couple of years, that under the treaty, especially in late summer, we're required under the proportional drafting provision of the treaty, which is and then to maximize power production. That's provision of the treaty that we, like in Arrow, would release flows first to produce additional power in the U.S. Prior to say Grand Coulee drafting Lake Roosevelt to produce power. So that's how it's set up under the treaty. And we've heard loud and clear that, that is creating unacceptable impacts in the Arrow Lakes Reservoir. And Mayor Hamling, if you know her, she's a dog with a bone on this one. And that is something that we're looking at too. We want to prevent that lowering of Arrow Lakes Reservoir through proportional drafting to the extent that occurred in the last couple of years. More than that, that's why we are looking at the mid-Arrow scenario, which would maintain the Arrow Lakes Reservoir at 1420 or 1425, maintain it all year round. So we are looking at options. Now, that's what we would like. On the U.S. side, they want more drafting in summer for fisheries flows and for power production, especially in low flow years. So obviously, there's some incompatibilities there.
Okay. Also, Rick Simpson says, thank you for an excellent presentation. I thought I better put that in there. Question from Janet, also from the CUSP, I think that's Janet Spicer. Has the Ernst & Young report on the cost-benefit analysis on the Columbia River Treaty been released to the public? If not, is there an estimated date of release?
It's not been released, and we won't release it. We had talked about, is there a portion that could be released? After going through it several times, what we could release, frankly, would be so innocuous that it wouldn't be terribly meaningful. And the reason for that is that we don't want to give away our negotiating strengths, our negotiating positions. So, I'm sure people understand that at this time we're not able to release that.
Okay. Question from John Wagner. Kathy, you mentioned some of the benefits in the U.S. received from the storage that are not included in the present.
Sorry. Okay.
Okay, that are not included in present Canadian entitlement calculations. Given that the U.S. is suggesting that the Canadian entitlement is too high, these additional benefits will be important to identify. Will Canada and BC be calculating the benefits of Columbia River Treaty storage for agriculture in the U.S.?
Well, yes. I mean, Grand Coulee, uh, Grand Coulee basically was the catalyst for expansion of agriculture. And there was a Crown Secretariat, BC Crown Secretariat, that looked at a little while ago, and they produced a paper to see whether or not the treaty had any impact on U.S. agriculture. And the conclusion at the time was that no, that there were other reasons for agricultural expansion in the U.S. And in particular, you know, the Lake Roosevelt Reservoir, the very inexpensive electricity pumping costs, and you know, other subsidies and assistance to the agriculture in the U.S., including economies of scale and generally less expensive production costs. So that study, and we can make it available, basically said no, the treaty did not provide provided an advantage to U.S. agriculture. That being said, we have looked at what would happen during a called upon scenario, or if we did not do proportional drafting on Lake Roosevelt reservoir levels, and how would that affect agriculture, and both in water supply and water availability. And so yes, we have looked at that, and it's not just the Ernst & Young report that has the information that is basically confidential to the province, but SFU, Adaptation to Climate Change, has produced 2 reports that we could put on our website or provide you links, looking at the economic value of ecosystem services of the Columbia River Treaty and the Columbia River, and they also look at a range of the value to not just ecosystem services but also agriculture and other interests. So we'll make that information available. That was done by SFU.
Okay. Ramonis asks, Fortis is the only operator on Kootenay Lake. The Crown Corporation is still the owner, as I understand it, and could influence the decision on a water use plan. My other question, well, okay, I'll stop there.
So yeah, you can stop there, because it really, Fortis basically, I mean, there are other power producers. I mean, Kootenay Canal is BC Hydro, and CPC is and Consortium is Brilliant Dam, but Fortis really is the entity that regulates the flows coming out of Kootenay Lake. So and it's caught up in this very complex Kootenay Coordination Agreement, Kootenay Canal Coordination Agreement, which I frankly don't even understand. So I think there needs to be maybe some more elevated discussions with Fortis, CPC, BC Hydro, and local governments and controller of water rights on asking some fundamental questions. Because my understanding was, and well, I shouldn't say don't quote me because all these people are listening, but the controller's office actually put the ball back in local government's court and said, what exactly are your objectives? What are you wanting to achieve? And and given Groman Narrows, which restricts, flows hydraulically, how much flex is there to be able to achieve what are some of your goals? And so I think there needs to be a circle back to that conversation of to local government saying, what are you looking for exactly? And then being specific, and then having, Fortis at the table with the controller's office. We can't, well, the controller can't obligate Fortis to agree to a water use plan without compensation. So I think there needs to be a lot more discussion around that. And maybe a bit of a focus group with local governments facilitated by the controller and others to say, okay, because it's different. It's different than Duncan, and it's different than Arrow Lakes. And again, there's the possibility of being able to manage differently if Groman Narrows would have been dredged and provided more flexibility. But because of that constraint, the opportunities to change flow management there might be limited. I just know just a little bit enough to get into trouble. So, but Ramona, maybe you should talk to Deb Kozak and Karen Hamling, and the or the AKBLG to make it a higher priority for discussion with the province.
And then one other, a very long question, second question from Ramona about making the benefits clear as we understand the new benefits. So is it possible to present the benefits to the U.S. that the U.S. are receiving alongside the benefits to Canada? People constantly bring new considerations forward, and the public needs a round picture to increase fairness. I had never considered how cheap water and power to Washington State was impacting fruit and agriculture in Canada, and those kinds of impacts are not top of mind. Thanks for this session.
Okay, so we have a discussion paper that we wrote specifically for the U.S. audience, and I don't know, Ramona, if you've seen it on our website. I think it was in 2013, and it was called Benefits to the U.S. of the Columbia River Treaty, and we wrote that to expand the conversation and to point out how they're benefiting across all of these different sectors, and it did change the conversation there, because since then, for example, there are officials in the Washington governor's office or others, when they make their presentations publicly now, include all of a suite of benefits from the Columbia River Treaty. And so it has made a difference, and there is a recognition of that. What there isn't a recognition is, well, what is the dollar value, right? And it's not just about dollars and cents, but it's also equally important for us to continue to go down there and show, like I showed my slides, some of the impacts, the historical and ongoing impacts. So I truly believe that in the U.S. they recognize all of the benefits, be it navigation or who are have a very strong voice, and they want to maintain the levels that make their use of the Columbia River possible, to the whole suite, and especially the tribes and others. So they know, but it's getting the conversation to sharing equitably those benefits that we haven't really had an opportunity, or that there hasn't been a strong willingness to sit down to talk about that. I think the more we stress the importance of the treaty to the U.S. interests, and what they might lose without a treaty, I think is beneficial in then setting the table to sit down to talk about how do we now share the benefits equitably.
Thank you. I have 4 more questions, I think.
And you know, that's all right, because in my calendar I thought it was 1:30 to 3:30, and I was wondering how on earth I was going to talk for 2 hours. As you can see, I don't have a problem with that.
Well, there's a lot of good questions. So Joanne Taylor, I think I can make this one question. Could Libby Dam be operated? Could Libby Dam be operated in the best interests of the diking system for the farmers in Idaho and Creston? Could the diking infrastructure on the Canadian side be revitalized for safety and flood integrity?
So I can't speak to how diking is managed in BC. I used to be able to, but now I've lost touch for that. I'm not sure what the answer is to that, Joanne, but I'm happy to take that and provide you directly with an answer, a fulsome answer on what are the programs that are available to the farmers in Creston to rehabilitate their dike. I know that when and I think you were there in Creston when we had the community meeting, and we did a study specifically at the request of Creston community on whether the treaty affected the diking system or not. And we hired an engineering firm to look at that, but I'd have to go back to that. I also know that the province has a funding or granting mechanism for in areas where diking maintenance priorities are identified, but not at a farmer level, but at a more system level. And I know that the water management branch of Flood Row a few years ago tried to facilitate a discussion with all of the farmers to try and identify which areas of the diking system would need repair. And I don't know, there may have been some work done, but I will follow up, Joanne, with that, because I know that coming out of those community meetings, there was the government, Dwayne Boyer from the Flynn Row did, and others from the Water Management Branch did have workshops there to look at the situation.
Okay, I guess it's really just one more question here, as far as I can tell, and it's from Susan Bond from Kimberly. Has the North American Water and Power Alliance been raised at any of the U.S. or Canadian meetings or discussions? And she says, or the Kootenai diversion?
No. That's just very simple. No, it hasn't been discussed. And the Kootenai diversion, we'll always have under the treaty or even non-treaty the right to divert the Kootenai into the Columbia. We could be cute and say, we may do that. But interbasin water diversion is obviously an issue from an environmental perspective. There'd be a whole pile of environmental issues around that. And could we divert part of it? Perhaps. I mean, that's always an option, and it'll always be an option. But we're not using that as a kind of a false threat at this point. We could say we're going to take out Kootenai Site Dam. No, I'm just kidding.
There was one question raised earlier. I think it was Joanne Taylor as well, and I had not set up the attendees to be visible to each other, and so what I'm going to do is follow up with the people who were in attendance and ask you each for permission to share your names with the other attendees. And so we'll just do that as a follow-up email with those people that are wanting to know who else was attending, because I think I would have had to set the permissions differently when you registered for me to be able to just show everybody who was there. I think it's just the privacy settings on the webinar, but I can follow that up. And then we'll just leave it up to people whether they want to, you know, build that community and see who is interested across this webinar. So with that, I would like to thank Kathy so much. You know, that's a really excellent presentation, and you could tell me that it was really an awesome range of questions you were able to answer, Kathy. And again, we'll have the webinar posted as a recording in about a week. And Kathy, I think, is making her PowerPoint presentation available as well. And so
I just have to fix it a little bit, and then I want to add more contact information, because I would encourage, you know, I had a chance to see some of the people who registered, and this is a very, very high-powered and informed group and influential people, and so, you know, I would encourage you to connect with each other, but I also want to be available to any of you if you have some follow-up questions as well. And I just want to thank you so very much to have the opportunity to update people and answer questions. We need to have more opportunities like this, and we'll keep finding different ones.
Okay. Thanks, everybody. Thanks all of you who came, and I'll be out. The Watershed Network will be in touch, and thanks again to Kathy. I'm going to close this down now. Thank you very much.